Hi there. Welcome to the Soul Restoration Project video on caring for grieving children in the wake of COVID-19. My name is Vanessa Longnecker. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with Soul Restoration Project, and this is one of a three-part series by the therapists at SRP addressing COVID-19 at the 1-year mark, March 2021. So this video will focus on how adults can see the signs of grief in children and support a child through a loved one getting sick with COVID and or dying from the virus. So we'll be going over 10 things to be on the lookout for. We'll also be taking a look at the lived experience of a longtime friend of SRP, Erin, who supported her family during her husband's battle with COVID. And we will end with some resources for you and your loved ones. So, grief. Let's go ahead and define it because we'll be mentioning it a lot in the next 20 minutes or so. This book, highly recommend if you are walking through grief yourself, defines grief as the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Right? When we think back on the past year, there's been so much that was familiar that has either ended or changed. And that brings up a lot of feelings, sometimes conflicting feelings, right? Kids are not exempt from that. They have experienced so much change and loss that can be kind of scary. And so for our purposes, right, we're focusing on the illness itself. What happens to a child when someone that they love is sick with COVID or dies from the virus? Now, every case of grief is unique because relationships are unique, right? Wherever there's familiarity and connection, there could be grief there when that ends or changes. So with that being said, here are some tips and things to be on the lookout for as you support a grieving child. Number 1, be on the lookout for avoidance. I'm not talking about the child in this one. I'm actually talking about us, the adults that are trying to support a grieving child, right? And it doesn't just have to be a parent. You could be a teacher, a youth leader, auntie, uncle, nanny, mentor, whomever. It's hard when there's a child in our life that's suffering. A lot of times we want to help and don't really know how. I've heard so many well-intentioned, loving adults really lean into their own avoidance because they're concerned that bringing something up will make the child feel worse. It makes sense. And yet, if a child has a loved one that is sick with COVID or has recently passed, they're already thinking about it. They're probably not feeling great. And so it's our job to tune into ourselves. That could be, scanning our bodies. That could be using mindfulness to pay attention to those places that are hard for us, the places where we might be tempted to avoid, because it is such a gift to acknowledge the reality of what's going on with someone else, right? For the grieving child, this gives them permission. This gives them an open floor, right? To be able to talk about it, right? To ask for a hug or to reject your offer and push you away. They're allowed to do that too. And yet, when we mention these things and work through our own avoidance, we help this difficult thing become a little bit more manageable for the child. Number 2, keep developmental stage in mind. So an infant is going to grieve differently than a 16-year-old. And yes, infants can grieve. So long as there is familiarity and a felt connection, they could experience grief when that connection changes or ends. So for an infant, That could look like lethargy. It could look like being less responsive. It could look like eating less or losing some weight. For an older kiddo, maybe preschool age, who's been able to conquer some developmental tasks, maybe he's able to use the toilet independently and go to sleep independently. For him, it might look like regression or a step backwards. So that could be more potty accidents, more tantrums. That could be issues going to sleep or not wanting to sleep alone. For kiddos that are engaging in imaginary play, right? So maybe younger elementary, don't be surprised if COVID themes or death themes show up in their play, right? Now, I've seen this more than a few times where something big, traumatic, something that feels out of their control shows up in a child's play. Now, for some adults, that can be really alarming. And the reflex, the instinct there might be to try to stifle it, to try to redirect it, to distract or do something else. But you're here listening, so I get to tell you that is actually really, really normal for children to take things that are, yes, grief related or traumatic, big and overwhelming that they don't have control over, and translate that into play where they are the ones in control and they get to kind of work it out on their own terms. So if this is happening, if the child in your life is playing and showing some of these COVID or death themes, this is hallowed ground. So what can you do, right? You can allow it to happen. It's okay. And you can ask questions, all right? Like, what's happening here? And, ooh, he's in the hospital. Does that hurt, right? Or how do they feel? You can reflect and label emotion as it comes up. You can ask them again how someone is feeling, or even share like, oh, they're in the hospital by themselves. That could be kind of lonely or maybe scary. What do you think? And see how they respond. Again, for older ones who might not be on the floor playing with dinosaurs or dolls, it could still show up maybe in art, poetry, music. Kids might kind of feel some energy drain. Again, more lethargy, like we saw in the infant, could also be in the older child or pre-adolescent. They might be more distractible and have low motivation to participate in things that they once loved. So before we get into tip number 3, I want to come back to our friend Erin, who was wonderful and gracious enough to allow me to interview her and use some of her experiences in this video. Thank you, Erin. Erin has 2 kids. When her husband became sick with COVID, she was managing them, their online schooling, and their feelings about their dad being ill. She also had 2 nephews whose parents also had COVID. So she was managing not only her 2 children, but her 2 nephews. All of these kids having to do virtual school and wondering if their parents were going to be okay. Now, just to let you all know, everyone did recover, and yet in those weeks, they didn't know that, right? There was so much unknown and great concern that came up during that time. And so one of the things that ties into our tip number 3 of keeping temperament in mind was something that Erin shared with me. She mentioned that obviously she knows her kids. She knows them pretty well. And so, one that already kind of leaned more towards being pensive became more withdrawn, more isolated in their experience of grief. Her other child, who has more energy and has to work that out physically, became even more physical. And that looked like, maybe picking fights with cousins and sibling. So her kind of feedback around that really caused me to reflect on that. Sure, the developmental stage will absolutely impact how a child grieves. Their temperament can also help to give us some clues as to which direction they might be leaning in, right? Like Erin's kids, the child that is already a little bit more melancholy or thoughtful could be tempted to lean pretty hard into withdrawing or isolating. The child that needs to move and like physically work things out on a trampoline or jujitsu or something might be a little bit more sensory seeking. And the blessed future CEO children might be a little bit more challenging or aggressive when they are dealing with all the feelings that can come up when they're grieving. Number 4, provide structure. So as much as is possible, it's helpful to keep routines and predictability, right? The structure helps kids to feel safe, especially when, again, something has already changed or ended. So what does this mean? This could mean mealtime, bedtime, piano lessons, family movie night, right? All staying as consistent as possible. When I spoke with Erin about this, we actually kind of had a chuckle, right? Like none of us are our best selves when we are very hungry or very tired. Her encouragement and reflection was to anticipate their needs as much as possible. Again, when the parent or caregiver or adult is also feeling the weight of this loss, it can be really challenging. And yet making sure that these kiddos don't get too hungry or too tired can be really beneficial. Number 5, provide language. And here I don't just mean emotional vocabulary, although if you know anything about me, I love emotional vocabulary and could talk about that for a very long time, but I won't. Here, what I mean is language around their coronavirus or death. Kids, again, especially the younger ones, have a very concrete understanding. They also have a pretty egocentric, self-focused understanding of the world. So we need to keep this in mind when we're speaking to them. Often, little ones can feel guilty or responsible somehow when a loved one gets sick or dies. So it's important to let them know that it's not their fault if they are feeling any of that burden. It's also important to stay away from metaphor, right? But instead speak in short sentences with age-appropriate language. Because again, metaphor, while it can be kind of comforting to us as adults or maybe an adolescent, for a younger child, it can be very confusing. So things like, God called him home, or she went to sleep and didn't wake up, could again cause a lot of confusion and anxiety, right? Well, if God called him home, when is God going to call me home, right? Or especially around sleep. Sleeping and not waking up is a thing. What if that happens to me, right? What if that happens to mom or dad? or brother or sister or someone that I love. So again, being brief but direct in an age-appropriate way is going to be the best way to give them language around this. So again, when I spoke to Erin about, oh my goodness, how did you talk to your kids? It's important to note that her children and nephews are tweens, early adolescents, right? So she didn't have very, very little ones to try to break it down to. But what I really appreciated about what she shared with me was that she was honest and didn't make any promises. One of her children asked very simply, "Is Papa going to be okay?" Her response was, "I hope so." Right? She didn't give false hope or try to, use metaphor or over spiritualize anything. It was just simple, honest, and age appropriate. When her husband was in the hospital, she told her kids that he would receive care there and could be monitored in a way that he couldn't if he were at home, which was true. Again, not making any promises about prognosis or a return home, but being direct, honest, and age appropriate in how she communicated with her kids. Number 6, model the behavior you want to see. Now, this is a good general rule just for interacting with kids. And yet, when it comes to grief, I think it can be really, really helpful to provide them a template for what to do with these conflicting feelings that might be coming up. I can't tell you how many times I speak with adults, and when we look back at some of their experiences of grief, they don't really have a recollection of their caregivers doing that around them, right? It's usually, the adults kind of took care of that behind closed doors, and now I guess I should take care of this behind closed doors too. And yet it's such a gift when we can share these things with children. Again, not in a way that burdens them or makes them feel like they have to care for us as the adults, but in a way that normalizes what they might be experiencing, right? So if you hope that your child would reach out, you reach out. Let them see you calling someone or asking for a hug. Let them see you cry. Let them see you and hear you say, "I miss him," right? Or I'm having a hard time today. That again helps to give them a template for what to do. For older kids, it might not be only modeling, right? Actually acting it out so they can see you and mimic you. It might be more of a conversation, right? About what you do to manage stress and difficult feelings, right? To let them know again that, kids and adults grieve. Wherever there's connection, wherever there was love, there will be a felt sense of loss when it changes or ends. Normalizing that and allowing them to see that you feel it too can be really helpful. Number 7, be prepared for other conversations around grief. So that favorite stuffy that they lost, that hoodie that they were super attached to and grew out of, that friend who moved away several years ago. Don't be surprised if other unresolved grief memories appear or reappear. It may not have anything to do with COVID or sickness or death, but it'll have everything to do with their prior experience of loss, and those feelings are valid. So if they share those things with you, acknowledge them, right? Without trying to minimize or compare to the current COVID loss, or find the silver lining. So that could sound like, I remember how much you loved that stuffy. It was sad when we couldn't find it. Or you loved wearing that hoodie. It's so hard when we have to say goodbye to things that we love. Or that was a tough day when your friend moved away. She was really great. Do you want to talk more about her? Just simple statements that acknowledge the loss, validate the loss, and leave the door open for conversation. Number 8, take care of yourself. Witnessing another person's grief is hard. Again, whether you are the parent, the teacher, the youth leader, the auntie, uncle, nanny, mentor, it's so challenging to see a small one that we care about hurting. And so we need to make sure that we are emotionally sturdy and weight-bearing for a child to feel safe enough to lean on us. So that means that we might need to take some breaths in the moment as we are being with them and practice some of our healthy self-care and coping in order to be regulated enough ourselves to lend a child our calm and provide co-regulation. Now, when I spoke to Erin about this, right, like again, she's got 4 kids in the house. She's managing all of these things. Her husband is sick and she's managing her own feelings and fears. I said, what did you do? How did you do it? How did you take care of yourself? And thankfully, she had some things in place. She had support in place that was beneficial through this. So what Erin shared with me was that she was able to go for daily walks alone. She was able to have space to be outside, to exercise, to not be a parent for a moment, and take care of herself. Now again, her kids are older, so it was okay for her to leave them. That might not be accessible for everyone, but that was what worked for her. During these walks, she was also able to call her people. She had a few tried and true friends that were walking through this with her, so she could cry and cuss and express her fears, her concerns, and experience comfort. She also continued to attend her regular counseling sessions virtually. So, right, talk about modeling. She would turn on her sound machine, make sure the kiddos were okay, and continue to carve out time to take care of her own mental health. Number 9, call for backup. Again, this is big stuff, right? Witnessing someone else's grief, managing what's coming up for ourselves. Oh my goodness. Definitely don't go it alone. Call for backup, whether that's neighbors, a faith community, friends, family. You can ask for other adults in this child's life to be more present so the child can confide in them, right? Asking for meals, finding an online seminar, a grief group, therapy. The list goes on. Again, for Erin, she had her people that she could talk to when she went on her walks. She had her counselor. That was an established relationship already. And for those that wanted to be supportive, but maybe were far away, she was able to ask for what she needed, right? Like Grubhub or DoorDash, a dinner would be great. And so there were people that cared about her and her kids who were able to step in and provide contactless meals while they were, again, sorting all of this out. So maybe you're thinking, I don't have access to all those things. Like, I don't have access to all those resources. My family's not nearby. I don't have X or Y or Z. How can I help the grieving child in my life? It's a valid question. And the point that I want to end on, number 10, I feel like is something that we can all take hold of no matter our context. And that's this: to never underestimate the power of an attuned adult in a child's life. We cannot take away their pain, unfortunately, in relation to COVID or anything else for that matter. But we can be with them in it, and that makes all the difference. Now, as far as resources go, there's a wonderfully done Daniel Tiger episode. That is season 10, episode 1, that addresses death. The children in the episode lose a pet fish and a strawberry plant. And they're encouraged to ask questions about what happened, that it might help, right? So it normalizes a lot of the feelings, questions, responses around death for young children. I have some books here as well that I'd love to share with you guys. The first is Tear Soup. And this is a great one that highlights the different ways that people can grieve and mourn. Really emphasizes the uniqueness, that the sort of recipe looks different for everyone. The next book is The Invisible String. I love this book. I've used it for years and years. Not always in relation to death, though it can be. This book highlights the fact that we are all connected by an invisible string when we love each other, even if we aren't in the same space, right? So that could be when a loved one has to quarantine or a loved one has to go into the hospital, right? And certainly can be applied if a loved one passes away. The next book here is The Memory Box. This one is specifically about grief and kind of walks through concerns once a loved one dies, right? Will I forget them? I don't want to. And sort of collecting different mementos and placing them in a box to revisit the memory of their loved one. And the last book I have here is kind of a classic, The Fall of Freddie the Leaf. And this book kind of goes through the life cycle, again, some anxieties around death as it approaches. But yeah, ends up being a really gentle, peaceful, kind of poetic sort of book. Now, do make sure to check the description box because we have some online resources from the CDC, the National Alliance for Grieving Children, Sesame Street, and more. And if you'd like more information about Soul Restoration Project and access to the other videos in our COVID series, please check out our website at soulrestorationproject.org. Thank you so much for your time.